The silence in the grand chapel of Harmony Hills wasn't just quiet, it was a heavy, crushing weight, pressing down as Gregory Hamilton's cold eyes met his bride, Abigail Evans. This was supposed to be it, the culmination of months of planning, of dreams carefully stitched into the seams of a simple, elegant wedding dress she'd found at a sample sale after weeks of searching. Abby had poured every ounce of her modest savings, and more importantly, her heart, into this day. She stood there, a kindergarten teacher from the quiet Willow Creek district, about to marry into the Hamiltons of Prescott Estates, a family whose name carried a certain weight in Harmony Hills, a weight Abby was only just beginning to understand. The scent of lilies and roses, chosen with such care, now seemed cloying, almost funereal. Humiliation, raw and public, began to wash over her face as Greg's next words, each one a precisely aimed dart, pierced the stunned air. "I can't do this," he declared, his voice devoid of the warmth she'd once cherished. "You're too poor. This was a mistake." Gasps, like a sudden intake of winter air, echoed through the cathedral. Abby froze, her carefully budgeted wedding dress suddenly feeling like a costume of naivety. Tears threatened, blurring the faces of the guests, blurring the future she thought was so certain. The cruelty of it, the sheer, bald-faced judgment of her worth based on a bank account, was a physical blow. And just as her world, her carefully constructed dreams, seemed to utterly collapse, just as the first tear was about to trace a path down her cheek, the massive oak doors at the back of the chapel burst open, a sound like a thunderclap banishing the oppressive silence. This story, you see, isn't just about a wedding gone wrong, though it certainly starts there. It's about the shocking discovery of hidden truths, the unexpected, almost unbelievable arrival of family from a past she never knew existed, and the profound, often painful journey to understanding one's true, immeasurable worth, a worth that has nothing to do with money or status. We'll explore how moments of deepest betrayal can sometimes, paradoxically, fling open doors to unimagined destinies and strengths we never knew we possessed. Before we dive deeper into the chaos that erupted and the astonishing arrival that followed, let's step back just a few hours, to the quiet hope of Abby's wedding morning, a morning that held no hint of the storm or the savior to come. Sunlight, usually a welcome guest, streamed through the thin curtains of Abigail Evans's cozy Willow Creek apartment, illuminating not just her simple white dress hanging expectantly on the closet door, but also a lifetime of carefully managed expectations. It was early, hours before the ceremony at the grand chapel, but Abby had been awake before her alarm. This was the day, her wedding day. The dress wasn't a designer label, no, nothing from the chic boutiques the Hamilton women frequented. She'd found it at a sample sale, a minor miracle of silk and lace that looked elegant without shattering her meticulously kept budget. As she made her morning coffee, the aroma a small comfort in the whirl of emotions. Abby glanced at her refrigerator door. It was covered, as always, with a vibrant collage of colorful drawings from her kindergarten students at Sunny Meadows. "Miss Evans is getting married," one proclaimed in wobbly crayon letters above a stick figure in a white triangle dress. A soft smile touched her lips as she ran her fingers over the childish artwork. Her students, in their innocent enthusiasm, were a grounding force, a reminder of simple joys and unconditional affection, a stark contrast, sometimes, to the more complicated world she was about to formally enter. She felt a quiet joy. Yes, but beneath it, a tremor of nervousness, a familiar whisper asking if she, Abby Evans, a teacher who found profound meaning in shaping young minds, truly belonged in the gilded world of the Hamiltons. Her mother, Helen Carter, arrived an hour later, her eyes bright with a mixture of pride and something less discernible, perhaps a shadow of old anxieties. With her was Susan Miller, Abby's best friend, her maid of honor, a steadfast presence of unwavering support. Helen's eyes welled with tears as she helped Abby into the wedding dress. "Oh, honey, you look beautiful," she'd murmured, dabbing at her eyes. "I just never thought I'd see this day." Abby laughed, a slightly strained sound. "Mom, don't start crying already. We'll never make it through the ceremony." She tried to keep it light, but Helen's next words, though well-intentioned, pricked at that underlying unease. "You marrying into a family like the Hamiltons," Abby gently corrected her. "I'm not marrying a family, Mom. I'm marrying Greg." It was a distinction she needed to make, for herself more than anyone. "Of course, honey." Helen had nodded quickly, perhaps a little too quickly. "I just meant such an opportunity. An opportunity." That's what this was to Abby. It was supposed to be about love. "Greg loves me for who I am," Abby said, her voice firm as she adjusted the simple pearl earrings, a graduation gift from her mother years ago. "My background doesn't matter to him." She said it with conviction, a statement she'd repeated to herself many times, a shield against the subtle, sometimes not so subtle, reminders of her different world. Later, as they made their final preparations, Susan, ever perceptive, caught Abby's eye in the mirror, her expression hesitant. "Has Beatrice Hamilton finally warmed up to you?" she'd asked quietly. Beatrice, Greg's mother, a woman who seemed to exude a cool disapproval that Abby found deeply unsettling. Abby had busied herself with her veil, a small, almost dismissive gesture. "Beatrice is who she is," she'd replied, feigning an indifference she didn't feel. "She'll come around eventually." The truth was, Beatrice Hamilton had barely concealed her disapproval from the moment Greg had introduced Abby. "A kindergarten teacher," Beatrice had said, her smile thin, her tone making it sound like a quaint, if somewhat unfortunate, hobby. How quaint. Abby had clung to the memory of Greg defending her then, telling his mother that her compassion and warmth were what attracted him. "Not everyone measures success by their bank account. Mother," he'd said. That memory was a balm, a reassurance she revisited often. The church the Hamiltons had selected, the Grand Chapel of Harmony Hills, was undeniably grand, far more elaborate, more imposing than anything Abby would have chosen. Stained glass windows cast colorful, solemn shadows across marble floors, and elaborate flower arrangements, undoubtedly costing more than her monthly rent, adorned every pew. It was beautiful, of course, but it felt like their stage, not hers. In the small antechamber, waiting for the signal to walk down the aisle, the carefully constructed dam of her composure began to crack. She overheard two of Greg's cousins from Prescott Estates, their voices carrying clearly in the hushed space. "Can you believe he's actually going through with it?" one whispered, a note of incredulity in her voice. The other replied, "Beatrice is beside herself. Darling, absolutely beside herself. Still, at least she's pretty, even if her dress is clearly off the rack." Abby's breath caught, her heart began to pound, a frantic bird against her ribs. Off the rack. Too poor. The unspoken accusations now given voice. Susan, sensing her distress, squeezed her hand fiercely. "Ignore them," she whispered, her eyes flashing with protective anger. "They're jealous because you found love based on who you are, not what you own." Abby tried to take a deep breath, to hold on to Susan's words, but the cousin's careless cruelty had reopened a wound she thought she'd managed to heal. One can't help but wonder, can love truly conquer such deeply ingrained prejudices, such casual disdain, or are some divides, whispered in antechambers and reflected in disapproving glances, just too wide to bridge when the moment of truth finally arrives? The walk down the aisle of the Grand Chapel felt less like a joyful procession and more like a slow march towards an unseen precipice, each step heavy with unspoken tensions. Frank Carter, her stepfather, the man who had raised her with quiet, unwavering love since she was 4, offered his arm, his eyes kind behind his glasses. "Ready, sweetheart?" he'd asked, and Abby had nodded, trying to push away the insidious doubts, the echo of the cousin's careless words. This was her day, hers and Greg's. Nothing else mattered, or so she told herself. But as they moved down the long expanse of marble, the grandeur of the chapel seemed to press in on her. She noticed Beatrice Hamilton's rigid posture in the front pew, her lips pressed into a thin, unyielding line. Several of Greg's business associates, men whose names she barely knew, were already checking their watches or scrolling distractedly through their phones. A knot of unease tightened in Abby's stomach. This wasn't the warm, intimate gathering of loved ones she had envisioned. This felt transactional. Then she saw Greg, waiting at the altar, tall and handsome in his perfectly tailored suit. For a fleeting moment, her worries melted away. This was Greg, the man she loved, the man who loved her. But as she drew closer, the relief evaporated, replaced by a chilling premonition. He wasn't smiling. As she took her place beside him, she saw his jaw was tight, his eyes avoiding hers, darting instead towards the front pew where his mother sat, like a queen holding court. "Greg," she whispered, a question and a plea in her voice. But he didn't look at her. The minister, oblivious to the undercurrents of ice, began speaking, his voice echoing through the cavernous space. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Greg shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a small, restless movement that screamed discomfort. Abby's heart sank. His mother, Beatrice, was staring at him intently from the front row. One perfectly sculpted eyebrow raised in an expression of cool, unyielding expectation. It was a look Abby had seen before, a look that always seemed to precede Greg capitulating to his mother's wishes. The minister continued, his words a distant drone, as Abby's focus narrowed on the silent, powerful battle of wills playing out between mother and son. "If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity, thick with unspoken words, with Abby's dawning horror. "Please, Greg," she prayed silently, "look at me. Remember us." But his eyes remained fixed somewhere beyond her, haunted. Then, to Abby's profound, sickening dread, Greg cleared his throat. The sound was small, but in the heavy silence of the grand chapel, it was a detonation. The minister looked startled. "I need to say something," Greg said, his voice carrying through the church, strained but clear. The minister, flustered, suggested, "Perhaps we could discuss this privately." "No." The word was flat, final. Greg finally turned to face Abby, but the man looking at her was a stranger. His expression was cold, distant, a look she had never seen before, a look that shattered her. "I can't do this," he stated, his voice gaining a chilling resolve. "You're too poor. This was a mistake." The words hit Abby like physical blows, knocking the air from her lungs. The church erupted in shocked gasps and hushed, horrified whispers. What she managed to breathe the word, her voice barely audible even to herself. "Let's be realistic. Abigail," Greg continued, his voice now loud enough for everyone to hear, his gaze sweeping over the assembled guests as if seeking their understanding, their validation for this public execution of her heart. "We come from different worlds. I tried to convince myself it didn't matter, but it does. I need someone who understands my lifestyle, my ambitions." He paused, then delivered the final, crushing assessment. "You'll always be limited." From her seat in the front row, Beatrice Hamilton nodded, a small, almost imperceptible dip of her chin, but it was a nod of profound, chilling approval. The room began to spin around Abby, her carefully constructed dreams, her hopes for a future built on love and mutual respect, were crumbling, turning to dust before the eyes of everyone she knew. Greg, her Greg, turned away then, stepping down from the altar without another glance in her direction. "Greg," she called, finding her voice at last, a raw cry of disbelief and pain. "You don't mean this. What happened to everything we talked about? Our plans, our future?" He paused, his back still to her, not even gracing her with a final look. "I've made my decision," he said, his tone utterly devoid of emotion. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience." The inconvenience. As if her broken heart, her public humiliation, were nothing more than a canceled dinner reservation, a minor disruption in his otherwise orderly, ambitious life. In a moment of such profound despair, with the weight of such a calculated betrayal crashing down, could anything, or anyone, possibly alter the course of this public ruin, this utter devastation of a loving heart? As the last echoes of Greg Hamilton's cruel dismissal, "I'm sorry for the inconvenience," hung in the air of the Grand Chapel. A new sound cut through the stunned murmurs of the guests. It wasn't a whisper or a gasp, but a thunderous boom. The massive oak doors at the rear of the church, doors that had seemed impervious and ancient, suddenly burst open with a force that silenced every other noise. All heads, which had been turned towards the tragic figure of Abigail Evans at the altar, now swiveled as one towards the back of the chapel. Framed in the grand doorway, silhouetted for a moment against the light from outside, stood a figure of quiet, commanding authority. He was a distinguished-looking man, silver-haired, dressed in what was clearly a bespoke suit, the kind that whispered of Savile Row and understated power, a suit that probably cost more than Abby's entire annual salary as a kindergarten teacher. Flanking him, almost blending into the shadows, were two other men in dark suits and earpieces, their eyes methodically scanning the room with a professional, vigilant alertness. The wedding planner, a woman whose composure had already been frayed to near breaking point by Greg's pronouncement, frantically flipped through her clipboard, her face a mask of confusion. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice thin and reedy. "This is a private ceremony." But the silver-haired man was already moving, striding confidently, unhurriedly, down the central aisle. He paid no heed to the wedding planner, no heed to the astonished faces of the guests who parted before him as if by an invisible force. His gaze, an intense, startlingly familiar shade of blue, was fixed, unswervingly, on Abby. She stood frozen at the altar, the carefully budgeted wedding dress shimmering faintly in the light from the stained glass windows, tears still wet on her cheeks, her mind a maelstrom of shock and humiliation. From the front row, Abby heard her mother, Helen Carter, make a strange sound, a choked gasp that was halfway between a sob and a cry of utter disbelief. Helen gripped her husband Frank's arm so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Helen," Frank whispered, his voice filled with concern. "Do you know this man?" But Helen seemed unable to speak, her face drained of all color, her eyes wide with a look of profound, almost terrified recognition. The silver-haired stranger reached the altar steps, stopping just below where Abby stood. Up close, she could see the lines of experience etched around his eyes that held a complex mixture of emotions, sorrow, perhaps a hint of regret, but overwhelmingly, a gentle, searching tenderness. Time seemed to slow as he looked up at her, his gaze never leaving hers. Then, his voice, rich and resonant, a voice that carried an innate authority, yet was imbued with an unexpected gentleness, filled the stunned silence of the chapel. "Hello, daughter," he said, the words simple, yet carrying the weight of an earthquake. "It seems I'm just in time." He paused, letting the words settle, then added, almost as an afterthought, "I'm Walter Montague." The name, Walter Montague, sent another wave of murmurs, this time not of shock at a groom's cruelty, but of sheer, unadulterated awe, rippling through the remaining guests. Walter Montague. Someone whispered, the name spoken with a kind of reverence. The Walter Montague, the tech billionaire. Even Greg Hamilton, who had been about to make his ignominious exit through a side door near the altar, froze in place, his hand on the doorknob, his face a mask of dawning, horrified comprehension. Abby stared at the man claiming to be her father, the father she'd been told had abandoned them when she was just a toddler. The man her mother, Helen, had always refused to discuss, his name a forbidden word in their small Willow Creek household. "I don't understand," she managed, her voice trembling, barely a whisper. "What are you doing here? How did you even know?" Walter Montague's expression remained solemn, his eyes holding hers. "I've been looking for you for a very long time. Abigail," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "A very long time." The woman Greg Hamilton had just publicly rejected as too poor, as someone who would always be limited, was apparently the daughter of one of the wealthiest and most powerful men in the country. The irony was so thick, so potent, it was almost a physical presence in the room. Beatrice Hamilton, Greg's mother, who had nodded so approvingly at her son's cruel dismissal of Abby, now looked as if she'd seen a ghost, or worse, a financial reckoning. In that moment, The carefully constructed world of the Hamiltons, built on social standing and financial pedigree, seemed to tilt on its axis. "The family needs privacy," one of Walter's security guards announced, his voice polite but unyielding as he and his colleagues began to expertly, efficiently, usher the stunned wedding guests, including a suddenly pale and flustered Beatrice, towards the exits. The church, which moments before had been a stage for Abby's deepest humiliation, was now abruptly, chaotically, transforming into the scene of an unimaginable reunion. When a truth you've lived by your entire life is shattered in an instant, how do you even begin to pick up the pieces of a reality you no longer recognize? A reality where the father you thought lost is suddenly standing before you. A billionaire who has searched for you for decades in the suddenly hushed grand chapel, now cleared of all but a stunned few. Abby, her mother, Helen, her stepfather, Frank, her best friend, Susan, the disgraced Greg Hamilton, and the formidable presence of Walter Montague and his security team. The weight of 25 years of unspoken history settled between them like a shroud. Abby, her mind still reeling from the seismic shifts of the last 10 minutes, struggled to process the dual blows: the public, brutal rejection by the man she thought she loved, immediately followed by the appearance of a billionaire father she never knew she had. She felt faint, her knees threatening to buckle, and Susan rushed forward, guiding her to a nearby pew. From the front of the chapel, Helen Carter approached Walter Montague cautiously, her face ashen, her composure gone. It was clear she was confronting a past she had long buried, a past that had just spectacularly, publicly risen from its grave. "Walter," she said, her voice strained, using his first name after a moment's hesitation where Alexander, a name Abby had never heard, almost slipped out. "After all these years." Walter's gaze, which had been fixed on Abby with a tender concern, shifted to Helen, and a different emotion, something harder, edged with old pain, flickered in his eyes. 25 years, 2 months, and 16 days. "Helen," he replied, his tone neutral but the precision of his words speaking volumes. "That's how long it's been since you disappeared with our daughter." The specificity was like a quiet accusation, a testament to years spent counting, searching. Frank Carter, ever the protector, moved to stand protectively closer to Helen, his hand on her arm, though he looked as bewildered as anyone. Abby, watching this exchange, found her voice, a voice laced with confusion and a dawning anger. "Why now?" she demanded, looking from Walter to her mother. "Why here, at my wedding? Did you know about this? Mom, did you know he was—" Walter Montague. Before Helen could answer, Walter turned back to Abby, his expression softening. "My investigators from Sterling Investigations finally located you just 3 days ago. Abigail," he explained, his voice gentle. "They found an article in the Harmony Hills Community Chronicle about your kindergarten class winning an award. When they informed me you were getting married today, I flew back from Seoul immediately. I had no idea what would happen at the ceremony, no inkling of this." He gestured vaguely towards Greg, who was still hovering near the side door, looking utterly poleaxed. "I just knew I couldn't miss the chance to finally see you, to speak to you." Greg Hamilton, clearly reconsidering his hasty exit now that the financial landscape had dramatically terraformed, cleared his throat, attempting to regain some semblance of composure. "Abigail," he began, his voice a poor imitation of its earlier confidence. "Perhaps we should talk privately. There's clearly been a misunderstanding." Abby's shock, momentarily eclipsed by the arrival of her father, now flared into a white-hot anger. "A misunderstanding," she cried, her voice trembling with fury. "You called me too poor in front of everyone I know. You humiliated me at what was supposed to be the happiest moment of our lives. And now," her voice dripped with sarcasm, "now that you think I might have access to money, now you want to talk." Before Greg could stammer a reply, Walter Montague stepped slightly forward, his quiet authority filling the space. "You're the groom, I presume?" he asked, his tone deceptively mild, though his eyes were like chips of ice. "The one who just rejected my daughter for her perceived lack of wealth?" Greg straightened his tie nervously. "Sir, if I had known she was your daughter, then—" Walter cut him off, his voice still quiet, but now edged with steel. Then what? You would have treated her differently, loved her more, been kinder. He shook his head, a look of profound disgust on his face. Thank you for showing your true character before she made the mistake of marrying you. The air crackled with tension. It was Helen who finally broke the standoff, her voice rising, years of pent-up emotion finally breaking through as she faced Walter. You were impossible, Walter, she burst out, her face flushed. All you cared about was your company, your empire. You worked 20-hour days, you missed her first steps, her first words, everything. Walter's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering beneath his skin. I was building a legacy for her. Helen, he retorted, his voice tight with controlled passion. For both of you, something that would last. She didn't need a legacy, Helen shot back, her voice raw with old pain. She needed a father, not an empire. Abby, caught in the crossfire of this decades-old argument, felt her head spin. This was too much. Too many revelations, too many raw emotions colliding in the wreckage of her wedding day. She pushed herself up from the pew, her legs unsteady. Stop it, she cried, her voice cutting through their bitter exchange. Both of you, I'm standing right here, after 25 years. I think I deserve some answers that aren't shouted across a church like accusations. Her words, born of sheer emotional exhaustion and a desperate need for clarity, hung in the air, silencing them both. It makes one ponder, doesn't it, how the choices made in the heat of youthful passion, the misunderstandings and fears that drive people apart, can echo so profoundly through decades, shaping lives, creating secrets, and ultimately leading to moments of explosive, painful revelation in the most unexpected of places. 30 minutes later, the grandeur of the grand chapel was replaced by the mismatched furniture and lovingly worn rugs of Abby Evans's tiny Willow Creek apartment. The scent of lilies and roses had given way to the familiar, comforting aroma of old books and brewing coffee. Abby, having swapped her ill-fated wedding dress for jeans and a soft sweater, sat curled in her favorite armchair, a mug cradled in her hands. The small living room felt crowded, not just by the presence of Walter Montague, her mother Helen, her stepfather Frank, and her best friend Susan, but by the sheer weight of unspoken history and monumental emotions. Everyone perched awkwardly, a tableau of stunned disbelief and raw, exposed nerves. A painful silence hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Finally, Abby looked directly at Walter, who sat on her slightly lumpy sofa, looking surprisingly out of place yet endearingly earnest. So, she said, her voice quiet but firm, I'm guessing you didn't just lose my phone number for 25 years. A sad smile curved Walter Montague's lips. You have my sense of humor, I see, he murmured, his eyes, so like her own, holding a deep, unreadable sorrow. He took a deep breath, the kind one takes before diving into cold, deep water. The truth is complicated, Abigail, he began, but you deserve to hear all of it. Your mother and I met when she was working as an executive assistant at my first tech company. It was a whirlwind romance. I was young, driven, perhaps a little reckless. She was brilliant, beautiful, and for a time, she was my whole world. Within a year, we were married, and you were on the way. Helen, sitting stiffly beside Frank on the love seat, stared down at her hands, her knuckles white. We were so young, she whispered, the words almost a sigh of regret. So idealistic, at first. Walter nodded, a shadow passing over his face. I was just starting to see real success with the company, he continued, his voice tinged with an old, familiar pain. And suddenly, I was working all the time, consumed by it. I was trying to build something that would last, something that would secure our future, your future. He glanced at Abby, a plea for understanding in his eyes. But you missed everything, Helen interjected, her voice gaining a bitter edge. Abigail's first steps, her first words, her first birthday. You were always at the office, or traveling for business, chasing the next deal, the next innovation. Walter didn't deny it. We fought about it constantly, he admitted, his gaze distant as he recalled those tumultuous years. Each time I promised to do better, to be more present, and each time I failed, the company. It had a momentum of its own. Abby watched the pain etched on both their faces, glimpsing the ghosts of the young, passionate couple they once were. A couple deeply in love, but unable to reconcile their vastly different needs and the overwhelming pressures of a burgeoning empire. "What happened?" Abby asked quietly, her voice cutting through their shared reminiscence. "Why did you leave, Mom? Why disappear so completely?" Helen looked up then, her eyes meeting Walter's, a silent, complex exchange passing between them before she turned to Abby. "After a particularly bad argument," she began, her voice trembling slightly, Walter, threatened to seek full custody if I kept, as he put it, interfering with his work." Walter winced, a look of deep regret crossing his features. "It was said in anger, Helen," he interjected softly. "I never meant it. I was frustrated, exhausted. But I believed you would do it." Helen continued, her voice gaining strength, the old fear still palpable. "You had the money, the power, the connections. I was terrified of losing my daughter, my Abigail." Her gaze on Abby was fierce with a mother's protective love. "So, one night, while you were on a business trip to Singapore, I packed our things and I left. I changed our last name from Montague to Parker, my mother's maiden name, not Price, as I might have misspoken in my distress earlier. We moved from California to Crestview, Arizona, just a small town then, hoping to disappear. Eventually, we ended up here in Harmony Hills." Walter then picked up the thread, his voice somber. "I hired private investigators, Sterling Investigations," he said, turning to Abby. "For years, I looked for you both, but your mother was thorough. New identities, no contact with mutual friends, a clean break. It wasn't until the internet era, until facial recognition technology became sophisticated enough, that we finally got a lead. So, how did you find me now?" Abby asked, the question hanging in the air. Walter reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. He carefully unfolded it and handed it to her. "This is from the Harmony Hills Community Chronicle, 3 months ago," he said. "Your school, Sunny Meadows Kindergarten, was featured in a local education piece. Your class had won a Community Garden Award." Abby took the clipping, her fingers tracing the grainy photo of herself, beaming, surrounded by her equally proud kindergarten students. Such a small, ordinary moment, a local feel-good story, yet it had bridged a 25-year chasm of silence and separation. "I've missed so much of your life, Abigail," Walter said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Your childhood, your education, watching you become this remarkable young woman. I can never get those years back, but if you're willing, I'd like the chance to know you now." Abby looked at this stranger who was her father, this powerful, wealthy man who seemed so genuinely vulnerable as he waited for her response. Then she looked at her mother, the woman who had worked multiple jobs to give her a stable life, who had sacrificed and struggled, and who had carried this enormous secret for so long. "I don't know what to say," Abby admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "This morning, I was about to marry a man I thought loved me. Now I discover he only valued wealth, and my long-lost billionaire father has suddenly appeared." She gave a shaky laugh. "It's a lot to process. Take all the time you need, Abigail," Walter said gently. "I've waited 25 years. I can wait longer if necessary." It was Susan, practical, loyal Susan, who had been quietly observing, who then interjected. "I hate to bring this up, but what about Greg? He's bound to come crawling back now, you know." As if summoned by her words, Abby's phone, sitting on the coffee table, lit up with an incoming call. Greg Hamilton's name flashed on the screen. Walter raised an eyebrow, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Abby reached out and decisively silenced the phone, the ringing cutting off abruptly. "He can wait," she said, a new firmness in her voice. "Right now, I have 25 years of questions for you. Such a tangled web of past hurt and present hope. When faced with so much, with a lifetime of secrets suddenly unearthed, how does one even begin to decide who to trust, and what path forward truly leads to healing, to understanding the complex tapestry of one's own life?" The week that should have been Abigail Evans's honeymoon at the Serenity Shores Resort. A week she'd imagined filled with sunshine, laughter, and the easy intimacy of new marriage passed instead in a disorienting blur. Each morning, she still woke with a moment of confusion, expecting to find herself in a luxurious suite overlooking a turquoise ocean, only to recognize the familiar, slightly faded floral pattern of her own Willow Creek apartment curtains. The raw pain of Greg Hamilton's public rejection remained, a dull ache in her chest, but it was increasingly, surprisingly, overshadowed by the extraordinary, almost surreal discovery of her father, Walter Montague. Walter, respecting her need for space and time to process, had taken a suite at the Oakwood Grand Hotel in downtown Harmony Hills. He made it clear, through gentle texts and brief, considerate phone calls, that he wasn't going anywhere until she was ready to talk more, to begin, however tentatively, to bridge the chasm of those lost 25 years. He was a quiet presence, a powerful force patiently waiting in the wings of her life, careful not to overwhelm her. Greg Hamilton, in stark contrast, was anything but restrained. His calls were incessant, a barrage against the fragile peace Abby was trying to construct. He left a string of voicemails, their tone shifting erratically from desperate apology. "Abby, I made a terrible mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. Please, you have to believe me." To a more demanding, almost aggrieved insistence. "Abigail, we need to talk. You owe me that much. At least..." He even sent an enormous, ostentatious arrangement of roses to her small apartment, a floral monstrosity that took up half her living room and seemed to mock the genuine, humble bouquets her students sometimes brought her. Susan, ever practical, had read the card accompanying the flowers with a snort of derision. "He says he wants to explain," she'd reported, tossing the card into the trash. "Claims it was pre-wedding jitters and a momentary lapse of judgment." Abby, watering her much more modest houseplants, deliberately ignoring the floral invasion, had replied dryly, "Interesting timing for his change of heart. Isn't it right after he discovered who my father is?" The transparency of Greg's motives was almost insulting, stripping away any lingering doubt she might have harbored about the sincerity of his original feelings, or lack thereof. Gradually, tentatively, Abby began to meet with Walter. They started with quiet dinners at discreet, out-of-the-way restaurants, places where his security team could ensure their privacy without being obtrusive. In these quiet corners, shielded from the curious eyes of the world, she began to learn more about this man who was her father. He spoke of his own journey, his rise from a driven, middle-class engineering student with a singular vision to a global tech visionary. He didn't boast, he spoke with a quiet reflectiveness, acknowledging both his triumphs and his regrets, particularly the immense personal cost of his relentless ambition. In turn, he listened, truly listened, as Abby shared details of her life, her education, her passion for teaching at Sunny Meadows Kindergarten, her friendships, her simple joys. He absorbed every detail with an eager, almost poignant interest, as if trying to piece together the missing years, to fill in the vast, empty spaces in the portrait of the daughter he'd never known. During one dinner, after Abby had been enthusiastically describing a recent breakthrough with a particularly shy student, Walter had smiled, a genuine, warm expression that reached his startlingly blue eyes. "You've done well for yourself, Abigail," he'd said, his voice filled with a sincere admiration that touched her deeply. "I'm proud of the woman you've become. Your mother, Helen, she did a wonderful job raising you." The genuine respect in his voice, his acknowledgement of her mother, despite their painful past, meant more to Abby than any grand gesture could have. It was on a Friday morning, about a week after the disastrous wedding, as Abby was in her classroom at Sunny Meadows, setting up finger paints on the art table for her incoming kindergartners, that her phone rang. Walter's name appeared on the screen. "Good morning, Abigail," his deep voice resonated, a comforting sound she was slowly growing accustomed to. "I hope I'm not interrupting your preparations." Abby smiled, balancing the phone between her shoulder and ear as she arranged small pots of vibrant paint. "Just setting up for a messy art project with a room full of 5-year-olds, she replied. "What could go wrong?" His warm chuckle made her smile. There was still something surreal about discussing kindergarten finger painting with a billionaire tech mogul, Yet Walter always seemed genuinely interested in the small details of her day-to-day life, never making her feel that her career choice was insignificant or her modest lifestyle something to be ashamed of, a stark contrast to the subtle condescension she'd often felt from the Hamilton circle. "I was calling to make you an offer," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "I need to return to my home in the Caribbean tomorrow, Montague Cay. There are business matters at MGT I can't postpone any longer." He paused, then continued. "I was wondering if you might consider joining me there next weekend. I could send the jet for you on Friday after school, and you could stay until Sunday evening." Abby nearly dropped a jar of blue paint. "Your private jet," she stammered, the casualness of the offer taking her breath away. "It would be the simplest arrangement," Walter said, as if he were offering to send an Uber. "I thought it might be good for us to spend some time getting to know each other properly, away from distractions. Distractions like Greg," Abby thought, and the media, which, as Walter gently informed her, had somehow gotten wind of Alexander Montague's long-lost daughter and had begun making discreet inquiries, even calling her school and loitering near her Willow Creek apartment building. "I'd understand completely if you're not comfortable with the idea. Abigail," Walter added quickly, sensing her hesitation. "Perhaps it's too soon." But surprisingly, Abby found herself saying, "No, actually, I think I'd like that." After the chaos and emotional turmoil of the past week, the idea of escaping to a Caribbean island, of having uninterrupted time with this father she was just beginning to know, was undeniably appealing. Besides, a deep curiosity was stirring within her, a desire to understand Walter's world, the world that might have been hers if history, and her parents' choices, had taken a different turn. A private jet, a Caribbean island. It felt like stepping into the pages of a fantastical novel, a life so far removed from her own. Yet, as she agreed, a small, unexpected flicker of excitement, of possibility, ignited within her. Maybe, just maybe, this was a journey she was meant to take. 3 hours after leaving Westridge Executive Airfield in a sleek private jet that felt more like a luxurious flying lounge than an aircraft, the descent towards Montague Cay began. Abby Evans peered out the window, her breath catching in her throat. Below, a jewel-toned tapestry of turquoise waters, fringed with white sand, surrounded a lush, emerald-green island, nestled along one pristine stretch of beach. A sprawling, elegant compound of buildings peeked through the palm trees. It was breathtaking, a world away from the early spring chill of Harmony Hills she had left behind. "Welcome to Montague Cay, Ms. Evans," the pilot's smooth voice announced over the intercom. "Current temperature is 82 degrees with clear skies. Mr. Montague is waiting for you at the main house." Abby felt a small knot of nervousness tighten in her stomach, mixed with a curious anticipation. She still felt a twinge of guilt about the sheer extravagance of having an entire jet at her disposal, but Walter had laughed it off when she'd voiced her discomfort. The plane was making the trip regardless. "Abigail," he'd explained, "I have executives flying back and forth from New York constantly. We just made sure you were the only passenger this time." His pragmatism was disarming. The plane touched down on a private airstrip with a gentle bump. As Sophia, no, Abigail. She had to remember her name here, in this new context. As Abby descended the stairs, she was struck by the warm, fragrant air, redolent with the scent of tropical flowers and salt. It was so different, so intoxicatingly alive compared to the crisp, familiar air of Harmony Hills. Walter Montague was standing beside a vintage, impeccably restored Land Rover, his face breaking into a wide, genuinely delighted smile when he saw her. "You made it," he said, stepping forward to greet her. There was a brief, awkward moment where neither was quite sure whether to hug or shake hands, a poignant reminder of the 25 years that lay between them, a gulf they were only just beginning to bridge. Walter, sensing her hesitation, gently took her weekend bag. "How was your flight?" he asked, his eyes, those startlingly familiar blue eyes, searching hers. "Definitely the most comfortable flying experience of my life," Abby admitted with a small laugh, following him to the vehicle. As they drove along a winding coastal road, The breathtaking scenery unfolded before her: turquoise bays, dense green jungle, vibrant hibiscus flowers spilling over ancient stone walls. "This place is incredible," she said, her voice filled with awe. "How long have you had it?" Walter's eyes were on the road, but his expression softened. "I purchased the island about 20 years ago," he replied, his voice a little distant. "It was around the time I'd finally accepted that finding you and your mother, well, that it might take much longer than I'd hoped. I needed a sanctuary, Abigail, somewhere to retreat when the search became too painful, too hopeless." Abby felt a pang at the reminder of all the years they'd lost, the years he'd spent searching. Despite her initial skepticism about his story, each interaction with Walter, each quiet revelation, had chipped away at her doubts, convincing her that he truly had spent decades looking for her, that he had never willingly abandoned her as she'd been led to believe. They rounded a bend, and the main house came into view, a sprawling, elegant structure with wide verandas and floor-to-ceiling windows, designed to capture the stunning ocean views. It was grand, undoubtedly, but without being imposing or ostentatious, much like Walter himself. As they pulled up to the entrance, several staff members emerged, their smiles warm and welcoming. "Welcome home, Mr. Montague." A woman in her 60s, with kind eyes and a serene demeanor, said warmly before turning to Abby. "And welcome to you, Miss Evans. I'm Eleanor Vance, your father's chief of staff. We're all so delighted to finally meet you." There was something in Eleanor's eyes, a genuine, almost maternal warmth that caught Abby off guard. "Thank you," Abby said, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "It's nice to meet you, too." "Eleanor has been with me for over 30 years, Walter explained, placing a hand briefly on Eleanor's shoulder. "She's more family than employee at this point." 32 years, Walter, Eleanor corrected with a gentle smile, then looked at Abby. "I've been hoping to meet you for a very long time. Miss Evans?" "Please," Abby said. "Call me Abby." Walter led her into the house, which was even more beautiful inside, open and airy, with natural materials, comfortable furnishings, and a sense of lived-in warmth rather than the cold, sterile luxury Abby had half expected. There were books everywhere, art on the walls that looked chosen with personal care rather than for status, and family photographs, though, Abby noted with a pang, none of her or her mother. Then, she stopped abruptly, her eyes drawn to a framed photo on a side table. It was her, or rather, a much younger version of her, maybe 6 or 7 years old, beaming from within a tangle of construction paper branches, clearly dressed as a tree in what appeared to be a school play. "How do you have this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper as she picked up the frame. Walter's expression was a mixture of profound sadness and tentative hope. "That was the first photo my investigators from Sterling Investigations managed to find of you after you disappeared," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was in a local newspaper in Crestview, Arizona, your elementary school's production of The Giving Tree. You were 7. Abby stared at the image, a ghost of a memory flickering at the edge of her consciousness. Then she noticed other frames nearby, more photos of her throughout the years. A slightly awkward middle school science fair photo, a triumphant shot from a high school track meet, her college graduation picture, smiling proudly in her cap and gown. "You've been watching me all this time?" she asked, a wave of conflicting emotions washing over her, touched, yet also a little unnerved. "Not watching," Walter said carefully, his gaze earnest. "Finding moments whenever I could. I was never close, never interfering, just making sure you were okay, collecting pieces of the life I was missing." He hesitated, then added, his voice raw. "I know it might seem strange, Abigail, even intrusive, but these photos, they kept me going when the search seemed hopeless." Abby sank onto a nearby sofa, the framed photo still in her hands, emotions warring within her. "I need a minute to process this," she murmured. "Of course," Walter said quickly, his understanding immediate. "Would you like to see your room? You can rest before dinner if you'd like." The guest suite was beautiful, a serene space with a private terrace overlooking the turquoise ocean. After Walter left her to settle in, Abby sat on the edge of the king-sized bed, trying to reconcile the man she was coming to know with these new, startling revelations. There was something both deeply comforting and profoundly disquieting about discovering she had never been as alone as she'd thought. That somewhere, her father had been collecting traces of her life, keeping her in his heart despite their painful separation. After freshening up, Abby decided to explore the house a little more before dinner. As she wandered down a hallway lined with bookshelves, she noticed a door that was slightly ajar. Curiosity overriding her hesitation, she pushed it open and froze. The room before her was unlike any other in the house. Where the rest of the home was open and bright, this space felt sacred, almost like a shrine. The blinds were partially drawn, casting long shadows. The walls were covered with an intricate timeline, photographs, newspaper clippings, documents, all connected with pieces of red string, like something out of a detective movie. In the center of the room was a large map of the United States, dotted with dozens of pins marking locations across the country. But what truly stopped Abby's heart, what made the breath catch in her throat, was the collection of wrapped presents stacked carefully along one wall, dozens of them, each labeled with her name, Abigail, and a date, birthday gifts. She realized with a jolt, 25 years of birthday gifts that had never been delivered. "I see you found the room." Abby turned to find Eleanor Vance standing quietly in the doorway, her expression gentle, understanding. "What is this place?" Abby asked, though in her heart she already knew the answer. "Your father calls it the heart room," Eleanor said, stepping inside. "It's where he kept everything related to you, the investigation files from Sterling, the photos we managed to obtain, the timeline of your movements over the years." She gestured to the presents. "And those, he bought you a birthday gift every year, Abigail, hoping he would find you in time to give it to you. When he didn't, he saved them. To discover you were never forgotten, that you were cherished from afar, every single year, for so long, it's a profoundly moving thought. But such a revelation, in a world of immense wealth and unspoken agendas, must surely come with its own shadows, its own complex implications." Returning to Harmony Hills from the sun-drenched tranquility and emotional revelations of Montague Cay, Abby Evans found that the knowledge of her new identity, Abigail Montague Evans, daughter of billionaire Walter Montague, had subtly, yet irrevocably, altered the landscape of her everyday life. It wasn't just an internal shift. The ripples were beginning to spread outwards, touching the familiar corners of her world in unexpected ways. The weekend on the island had been a whirlwind of emotion, connection, and startling discoveries. She'd seen the heart room, a testament to 25 years of a father's unwavering love and relentless search. They had talked for hours, sharing stories, filling in the vast blanks of their separated lives. Abby felt a genuine, growing affection for Walter, a sense of rightness, of a missing piece finally slotting into place. Yet, Eleanor Vance's quiet warning about the complexities of Walter's world, about people who might suddenly find her more interesting, echoed in her mind. The changes were small at first, almost unnoticeable. A parent at Sunny Meadows Kindergarten, a wealthy mother who had barely acknowledged Abby's existence beyond polite, perfunctory nods at pickup time, suddenly approached her with a warm smile and an invitation to join the board of an exclusive local children's charity. "We'd be so honored to have your perspective. Abigail," she'd gushed, using her first name with an unearned familiarity. Her landlord, who had been notoriously slow to respond to maintenance requests for her modest Willow Creek apartment, now had a plumber fixing her perpetually leaky faucet within hours of her renewed call. Even the barista at her local coffee shop, where she ordered the same simple latte every morning, now eyed her with a new curiosity, a subtle deference in his usually casual demeanor. Word had spread, it seemed, through the invisible networks of Harmony Hills society. The humble kindergarten teacher was now Alexander Montague's long-lost daughter, and that, apparently, changed everything. A few days after her return, Walter, who was in town for a series of MGT board meetings, invited Abby to dinner. "I'll be at the Oakwood Grand, as usual," he'd said, "but perhaps dinner somewhere a little more celebratory. There are some people I'd like you to meet." Abby, though still navigating the emotional aftershocks of her new reality, agreed. She was curious, and she trusted Walter. That evening, a sleek town car, a quiet MGT vehicle, picked her up from her apartment. She was taken not to a familiar restaurant, but to the City Club, an exclusive downtown establishment she'd only ever read about. Walter greeted her warmly in a private dining area, the Founder's Room. "I hope you don't mind the slight change of plans," he said, kissing her cheek. "These are some key members of my executive team from Montague Global Tech. They happen to be in town for our meetings, and I very much wanted them to meet you." Over the next 2 hours, Abby was introduced to a parade of polished, articulate professionals, MGT's chief legal counsel, its chief financial officer, its head of global operations. Each greeted her with what seemed like genuine pleasure, though she couldn't help noticing the quick, assessing looks that accompanied their welcoming smiles, the subtle calculations behind their polite inquiries about her life and her sudden appearance in Walter's. One man, in particular, stood out. Vince Ramsey, introduced as Walter's protege and the executive vice president of MGT, he was in his early 40s, with sharp, handsome features, watchful, intelligent eyes, and an air of restless ambition that even his impeccably tailored suit couldn't quite conceal. His handshake lingered a moment too long as he studied her. "The resemblance is remarkable, Miss Evans," he commented, his voice smooth as silk. "You have your father's eyes. It's truly extraordinary that fate has brought you back into his life after all these years." There was something in his tone, a subtle tightness beneath the polished words, an almost imperceptible edge, that put Abby instantly on guard. "Yes," she replied simply, her own voice carefully neutral. "Quite extraordinary." As dinner progressed, Abby, a keen observer from her years of managing a classroom of diverse personalities, watched the dynamics at the table with growing interest. The executives clearly respected Walter, deferring to his opinions, laughing a little too readily at his occasional jokes. But they also watched him carefully, adjusting their comments, their proposals, based on his reactions. Vince Ramsey, in particular, seemed to tune into Walter's every gesture, every nuance, often finishing his sentences or reinforcing his points with an almost unnerving prescience. "Vince has been my right hand for nearly 15 years, Walter explained at one point, noticing Abby's attention. He joined the company straight out of business school and has been on a meteoric rise ever since. Many consider him my presumptive successor." At the word successor, Abby noticed a subtle, almost electric shift in the room's atmosphere. Vince Ramsey's smile tightened, becoming almost imperceptibly strained, while the CFO and the chief legal counsel exchanged a quick, unreadable glance. "Of course," Walter continued, a fond smile directed at Abby. "Recent events may necessitate some reconsideration of our long-term strategic planning." He paused, then added, his voice gentle but carrying immense weight. "Family has a way of reshaping priorities, doesn't it?" The implications of this statement weren't lost on anyone at the table. Least of all, Vince Ramsey, whose knuckles, Abby noticed, whitened around the stem of his water glass. For the first time, Abby fully understood the depth of Eleanor Vance's warning on Montague Cay. Her appearance in Walter Montague's life hadn't just filled a personal, familial void. It had disrupted a carefully established, immensely valuable corporate succession plan. After dinner, as Abby was preparing to leave, Vince Ramsey approached her by the coat check. "It was a pleasure meeting you, Miss Evans," he said smoothly, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "Walter speaks of nothing else these days. It's remarkable how quickly you've become the center of his world." Abby chose her words carefully. "We're just getting to know each other. 25 years is a lot of catching up to do." Vince nodded, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Indeed. And Walter is nothing if not thorough when he sets his mind to something. I imagine he's already discussing the company with you, your potential role in its future." "Actually, no," Abby said truthfully. "We've focused on personal matters so far." "How refreshing," Vince murmured, though his tone suggested anything but. "Though, if I may offer some friendly advice, Corporate governance and succession planning are complex areas with significant legal and fiduciary implications. It would be unfortunate if Walter's understandable emotional response to finding you led to hasty decisions that might not serve the company's best interests. Before Abby could respond to this thinly veiled warning, Walter appeared beside them. "Ready to go, Abigail?" he asked, placing a gentle yet undeniably protective hand on her shoulder. His eyes, however, were fixed on Vince Ramsey with an unreadable, almost challenging expression. It's a strange dance, isn't it? When personal joy intersects with corporate power, new allegiances form, and old ambitions can curdle into something far more dangerous. Who can truly be trusted when so much is at stake, and a life's work, a billion-dollar legacy, hangs in the balance, the glittering skyline of the city, usually a symbol of ambition and success for Harmony Hills, now seemed to hold a more ominous glint for Abby Evans as she sat beside her father in the quiet luxury of his town car. Vince Ramsey's parting words, his friendly advice, echoed in her ears, a thinly veiled threat that left a chill despite the car's warm interior. "Is Vince always so intense?" she asked Walter as they pulled away from the city club. Walter chuckled, though there was little humor in the sound. "Vince is brilliant, dedicated, and fiercely ambitious. Abigail," he said, his expression growing serious. "He's helped build Montague Global Tech into what it is today, and for that, I will always be grateful." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But yes, he can be intense, especially when he feels his position, his future, might be threatened." Abby looked at him, incredulous. "Threatened by me?" she asked, a note of disbelief in her voice. "Walter, I'm a kindergarten teacher. I spend my days with glitter glue and story time, not corporate mergers and stock options." Walter's expression softened, his eyes filled with a deep, paternal affection. "You're my daughter, Abigail," he said gently. "My only child." In Vince's mind, and perhaps in the minds of others at MGT, that changes everything. Regardless of your current profession or your interest in the company, your very existence alters the landscape of the future. He hesitated for a moment, then continued. "There's something else you should know, something I've been meaning to discuss with you. The MGT board has scheduled a press conference for next month. I was planning to use that occasion to officially announce you to the world as my daughter and as my heir." The word heir hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Abby was only just beginning to grasp. "Heir," she repeated, startled. "Walter, I appreciate the sentiment, truly I do, but I don't know the first thing about running a global corporation. I'm happy teaching 5-year-olds their ABCs at Sunny Meadows." "Of course you are," Walter assured her, his hand briefly covering hers, "and I would never, ever push you into a role you didn't want or weren't prepared for. Your happiness, your fulfillment, that's what matters most to me." He sighed. "But by publicly acknowledging you as my daughter, certain legal realities automatically come into play regarding inheritance and succession. It's not something we can simply ignore, even if you choose never to set foot in an MGT boardroom." Abby frowned, processing this new, complex piece of information. "And this would affect Vince's position?" she asked. Walter nodded slowly. "Let's just say it would introduce variables into a future that Vince, and perhaps others, had previously considered quite settled." The following weekend, Abby met Susan Miller for their regular Saturday brunch at the Corner Nook, their favorite local cafe, a small, unpretentious place worlds away from the city club. After catching up on regular life matters, Susan's latest dating adventures, Abby's challenging but rewarding week with her kindergartners, Abby shared her concerns about Vince Ramsey and the unexpected corporate politics she'd been thrust into. "I never asked for any of this," she sighed, stirring her latte. "I was just starting to enjoy getting to know my father as a person, as Walter, not just the billionaire. And now, suddenly, I feel like I'm in the middle of some succession drama straight out of a TV show." Susan listened intently, her expression thoughtful. Then, she lowered her voice, leaning conspiratorially across the small table. "Speaking of drama," she said, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of concern and intrigue, "have you heard from Greg Hamilton lately? Is he still bombarding you with those pathetic texts and calls? He's still sending daily messages, a mix of, I miss you, and we need to talk urgently, Abby replied, a weary note in her voice. Though I've stopped responding. Why do you ask? Because, Susan said, pulling out her phone and scrolling quickly through an Instagram feed. I saw something interesting yesterday that might shed some light on Mr. Hamilton's sudden desperation. She turned the phone screen towards Abby. My cousin's girlfriend, Jenna, who works as a paralegal at Crestline Financial Group, the firm that finances most of Greg's real estate developments. Abby nodded, a sense of unease beginning to prickle at her. Well, according to Jenna, Susan continued, Greg's company, Hamilton Developments, is in serious trouble. They've lost several major investors in the past month, and word on the street is they're scrambling to avoid bankruptcy. Susan then showed Abby a cryptic social media post from an anonymous financial blogger, a vaguely worded complaint about supposedly successful local developers who were actually running on fumes and robbing Peter to pay Paul. While it didn't name Greg Hamilton or Hamilton Developments directly, the implications, given what Jenna had said, were clear. The timing was deeply suspicious. You think that's why he's suddenly so desperate to reconcile? Abby asked, her voice barely a whisper, as the pieces began to click into place. Because he needs money, because he thinks, through me, he can get to Walter's money. Susan shrugged, her expression sympathetic. I'm just saying the timing is interesting. Abby, he dumps you at the altar for being too poor. Then, within days, he discovers you're a billionaire's daughter, right when his own financial empire is apparently crumbling. That's quite a coincidence. Don't you think, troubled by this revelation, by the sheer mercenary calculation it implied, Abby decided to do some investigating of her own. That evening, back in her Willow Creek apartment, she began searching online for information about Greg's recent projects. Most news articles and promotional materials portrayed his developments as successful, innovative, even visionary. But as she dug deeper, scrolling through obscure financial forums, local planning commission minutes, and disgruntled investor comments, she found concerning patterns, reports of significant construction delays, unresolved permit issues, and indeed, several mentions of major investor pullouts and rumored cash flow problems. As she was sifting through this morass of troubling information, her phone lit up with a text from Greg. Missing you tonight. Abby, we really need to have dinner tomorrow. There's something important I want to discuss. The message, once perhaps capable of evoking a twinge of regret or confusion, now felt utterly transparent, manipulative. The next day, after her students at Sunny Meadows had gone home, Abby was erasing the colorful drawings from the chalkboard when she heard a soft knock at her classroom door, expecting the school janitor, old Mr. Henderson. She turned, a friendly greeting on her lips, but the man standing in the doorway wasn't Mr. Henderson. It was Vince Ramsey. When the threads of deceit begin to unravel, it often reveals a pattern far more intricate and dangerous than initially imagined. How far will people go when their ambitions, their reputations, or their very livelihoods are on the line? And who else might be caught in their desperate machinations? Vince Ramsey's presence in the bright, cheerful chaos of Sunny Meadows kindergarten felt like a dark cloud trespassing in a sunlit sky, an intrusion that sent a shiver of unease down Abby Evans's spine. Her classroom, with its colorful alphabet charts, finger-painted masterpieces proudly displayed, and shelves overflowing with well-loved children's books, was her sanctuary, a world away from the high-stakes corporate intrigue she was beginning to glimpse. To see Vince Ramsey standing in its doorway, impeccably dressed in a bespoke suit that seemed to absorb all the light, felt jarring, almost a violation. "Mr. Ramsey," she said, unable to hide her surprise, her voice cooler than she intended. "This is unexpected. Please, call me Vince," he replied, stepping into the classroom with an air of unearned familiarity. He glanced around, a faint, almost condescending smile playing on his lips as he took in the child-sized tables and chairs, the vibrant artwork. "Charming space," he commented, his tone making it sound anything but So different from the corporate boardrooms I'm used to. He paused, his gaze settling on her, sharp and assessing. What can I do for you, Mr. Ramsey? Abby asked, deliberately keeping the worn teacher's desk between them. A small, symbolic barrier. There was something deeply unsettling about Vince Ramsey's presence here, in her world. Worlds colliding in a way that felt invasive, almost predatory. I thought we should have a frank conversation. Abigail, Vince said, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. Away from Walter's watchful eye, so to speak. He moved closer, perching casually on the edge of one of the small student tables, a gesture that felt both calculatedly informal and subtly dominant. He's a remarkable man, your father, Vince continued, his expression one of feigned admiration. Brilliant visionary, a true pioneer. MGT wouldn't be what it is today without him. He paused, then added, his voice laced with a carefully calibrated concern. But sometimes, even the most brilliant minds can let personal feelings cloud their business judgment, and you're here to make sure that doesn't happen. Is that it? Abby guessed, her own voice tinged with suspicion. Vince smiled thinly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I'm here, he said, his voice hardening almost imperceptibly, because I've dedicated 15 years of my life to Montague Global Tech. I've sacrificed relationships, health, personal interests, everything, to help build Walter's vision into reality. He picked up a small, lopsided clay sculpture one of her students had made, turning it over in his fingers as if it were an alien object. I was there during the company's darkest days, Abigail, when we nearly went bankrupt. I helped Walter rebuild, restructure, and emerge stronger. I've earned my place as his successor. That's between you and my father, Mr. Ramsey, Abby said firmly, refusing to be drawn into his narrative. It has nothing to do with me. But it does, Abigail, Vince countered, his voice smooth but insistent as he set the clay sculpture down with a dismissive little click. It has everything to do with you, because Walter is planning to announce you as his heir at next month's press conference. He let that sink in, his eyes boring into hers. A kindergarten teacher with no business experience, no understanding of our complex corporate structure, no knowledge of the global markets we navigate, suddenly positioned to potentially control billions of dollars and the livelihoods of thousands of employees. His tone was a carefully constructed blend of concern and subtle derision. I haven't asked for any of this, Abby insisted, her frustration growing. Perhaps not explicitly, Vince acknowledged with a slight inclination of his head. But your very existence, Abigail, threatens the stability of everything we've built at MGT. He leaned forward, his voice dropping again. Unless, of course, we can find a reasonable accommodation. What kind of accommodation did you have in mind? Abby asked, her heart beginning to pound with a sense of foreboding. Vince's expression grew calculating. You want a relationship with your father. That's understandable, natural, even. But you don't need to disrupt the corporate succession plan, a plan that has been years in the making. To have that, he paused, then delivered his proposal. Sign a simple agreement, Abigail, waiving certain inheritance rights related to company control of MGT, and I'll personally ensure that Walter still provides generously for you, for your personal needs. Everyone wins. The audacity of his proposal left Abby momentarily speechless. Let me get this straight, she said finally, her voice tight with anger. You want me to sign away rights I didn't even know I had, rights I haven't even had a chance to understand, all to protect your position at MGT. I'm offering you a clean solution. Abigail, Vince replied, his tone hardening, a hint of impatience creeping in. Before things get complicated. He leaned even closer, his voice now a low, menacing purr. Walter's health isn't what it once was. He pushes himself too hard. Stressful situations, major upheavals, they could be problematic for him. The implied threat was unmistakable, chilling. Are you suggesting, Abby asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her anger, that my presence in his life is harmful to him? I'm suggesting, Vince said, his eyes cold and hard, that corporate power struggles can be extremely stressful. Abigail, especially when they involve family. And Walter, despite his strength, is not immune to stress. Before Abby could respond, before she could voice the outrage pervading inside her, another figure appeared in the classroom doorway. It was Greg Hamilton, holding yet another ridiculously large bouquet of flowers. "Abby, I was hoping," he began, then stopped abruptly, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw Vince Ramsey. "Oh, I didn't realize you had company." The two men, Vince Ramsey and Greg Hamilton, assessed each other with an immediate, almost palpable weariness, like predators encountering an unexpected rival in their hunting ground. Something in their mutual recognition, a flicker of something too familiar in their guarded expressions, struck Abby as odd, too knowing for men who should, by all accounts, have been strangers to each other. "Do you two know each other?" she asked, her gaze shifting between them, a new, unwelcome suspicion beginning to form. "No," they answered, almost simultaneously, their denials a little too quick, a little too forceful. They exchanged a swift, almost imperceptible glance. "Mr. Ramsey was just leaving," Abby said pointedly, her voice firm. "And Greg, I've told you to stop coming to my workplace." Vince straightened his already perfect tie. "Think about what I said, Miss Evans," he said, his voice cool and controlled. "Some decisions need to be made before the press conference, for everyone's benefit." With a curt, dismissive nod to Greg, he left the classroom. As soon as Vince was gone, Greg stepped forward, his expression a mixture of feigned concern and poorly concealed curiosity. "What was that about?" he asked. "What press conference? Nothing that concerns you, Greg," Abby replied, taking the flowers from him and placing them on a counter without enthusiasm, her mind still reeling from Vince's veiled threats. She needed to talk to Walter, and soon. That Saturday, the call came from Eleanor Vance. Walter wanted to see her. But the driver, instead of taking her to the Oakwood Grand or a familiar restaurant, pulled up outside the Parkview Medical Tower, a sleek, modern building that housed some of Harmony Hill's most exclusive medical practices. A knot of apprehension tightened in Abby's stomach. In a luxurious reception area on the top floor, signs pointed to Alistair Finch, M.D., Cardiology Center. Walter was waiting for her, his expression unusually grave. "Abigail," he said, kissing her cheek. "I'm sorry for the unusual setting. I had my regular checkup today, and Dr. Finch suggested I might want to share the results with you." A distinguished older man in a white coat approached, extending his hand. "Miss Evans, I'm Dr. Alistair Finch. I've been your father's cardiologist for nearly a decade." The gravity in his expression sent a chill through Abby. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Walter gestured to a private consultation room. "Let's sit down. Abigail, there are some things you should know." "Inside, Dr." Finch showed Abby a series of complex images on a large screen, scans of Walter's heart from different angles, certain areas highlighted in ominous shades of red and yellow. "Your father has a condition called progressive myocardial fibrosis," Dr. Finch explained gently. "It causes a gradual stiffening of the heart muscle, making it increasingly difficult for the heart to pump efficiently." Abby turned to Walter, her eyes wide with fear. "How serious is it? Manageable, for now," Walter replied, his voice quiet but steady. "I've had it for years, but it's progressing more rapidly now than we'd hoped. Without intervention," Dr. Finch continued, his tone serious, "the condition would typically give Walter about 12 months of relatively normal function before more severe symptoms develop." "And with intervention?" Abby asked, her mouth dry, her world tilting on its axis once more. "We're exploring several treatment protocols," Dr. Finch assured her. "Experimental therapies that show promise. Walter has excellent general health otherwise, which works in his favor." After Dr. Finch left them alone, Abby sat in stunned silence, the doctor's words echoing in her ears. 12 months. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she finally whispered, her voice choked with unshed tears. "I didn't want to burden our new relationship with my health concerns." "Abigail," Walter admitted, his own eyes filled with a deep sadness. "We were just getting to know each other, finding our way as father and daughter. But with the MGT press conference approaching, and certain business matters needing attention, I realized you needed to know the complete picture. Is this why Vince is so concerned about the succession plan? Abby asked, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. Because he knows you're ill, Walter nodded. Vince is aware of my condition, as are key members of the MGT board. It's partly why the succession plan, with him as successor, was so firmly established, to ensure stability for the company in case my health deteriorated suddenly. He reached across the table and took her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. But finding you, Abigail, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That's changed everything? Not just personally, but in terms of my legacy, what I want to leave behind. Abby's eyes filled with tears. I don't want your legacy, Dad, she said, the word dad slipping out naturally for the first time. I want more time with my father. We've already lost 25 years. Such a heavy burden for a daughter, just reunited with her father, the joy of connection tinged with the fear of loss, and the chilling realization that others might be callously factoring his mortality into their own ambitious equations. It makes you wonder, what choices will she make now, knowing that time itself is a precious, dwindling commodity, and that the wolves are not just at the door, but perhaps already inside the house. The information Susan Miller held on her tablet wasn't just data. It was a roadmap to a betrayal so calculated, so deeply woven into the fabric of Abby Evans's life for the past 3 years, that it threatened to unravel her very understanding of reality. Later that same evening, after the devastating visit to Dr. Finch's office at the Parkview Medical Tower, Abby returned to her Willow Creek apartment, her mind a tumult of fear for her father and a simmering, unfocused anger. She found Susan waiting outside her door, an almost electric excitement radiating from her, her tablet clutched in her hand like a modern-day oracle. "You are not going to believe what I found," Susan said the moment they were inside, her voice a low, urgent hiss. It took some serious digging, Abby, hours of cross-referencing and going down internet rabbit holes, but there's definitely a connection between Greg Hamilton and that creep Vince Ramsey, a big one. Susan pulled Abby over to the sofa and began swiping through a series of images on her tablet, screenshots from obscure social media accounts, archived news articles from regional business journals, database records from corporate registries. "Okay, look at this," Susan said, pointing to a slightly grainy photo. "This is from a charity golf tournament at the Prescott Hills Country Club 3 years ago. That's before you even met Greg, right?" Abby nodded, her stomach clenching. In the background of a group shot, almost out of focus but undeniably them, stood Greg Hamilton and Vince Ramsey, heads inclined towards each other as if in serious conversation. "That could be a coincidence," Abby said, though a cold knot of suspicion was forming in her chest. "Sure, it could be," Susan conceded, "but this isn't—" She swiped to another image, a crisply professional photo from a real estate investment conference held in a neighboring state 2 years ago, right around the time Abby and Greg had started dating. And there they were again, Greg Hamilton and Vince Ramsey, sitting side by side on a panel discussion titled Emerging Markets and High-Yield Developments. There was no mistaking them, no possibility of coincidence this time. "There's more," Susan said grimly, her fingers flying across the screen. "I found financial records, public filings, showing that Crestline Financial Group, the firm Jenna said is financing most of Greg's developments and where he's supposedly having cash flow problems. Well, Crestline has significant investment ties to a venture capital group, Apex Ventures, where one Mr. Vincent Ramsey sits on the advisory board." Abby sank back against the sofa cushions, the implications washing over her in a sickening wave. "Are you saying," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "are you saying that Greg knew who I was all along? That he pursued me, dated me, proposed to me because of my connection to Walter, to MGT? I can't prove intent, Abby, not from this alone," Susan admitted, her usual ebullience tempered by a fierce loyalty and anger on Abby's behalf. "But the timing is beyond suspicious. Think about it. Greg's company, Hamilton Developments, started receiving major financing tranches from Crestline via Apex Ventures, Around the same time, he coincidentally met you at that community center volunteer event where you were reading to kids from Sunny Meadows. The community center? Abby suddenly remembered something odd, something she'd dismissed at the time. Greg, a successful, high-flying real estate developer with no previous history of volunteering for children's programs, had shown up that specific Saturday, the one day she was scheduled to help with the children's reading program. He'd been charming, attentive, expressing a sudden, newfound interest in early childhood literacy. At the time, she'd found it endearing, almost too good to be true, that such a wealthy, handsome man would give his time so generously, so spontaneously. Now, it seemed utterly, chillingly calculated. "He was tracking me," Abby whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Vince must have told him about Walter's search, about me. The casual encounters, the shared interests that seemed so organic, the whirlwind romance, had it all been a meticulously crafted illusion, a 3-year performance? "I need to see his apartment," Abby said suddenly, a desperate resolve hardening her voice. "What? Why?" Susan asked, startled. "Because if Greg has been working with Vince all along, if this has been some kind of long con, there might be evidence in his home," Abby replied, her mind racing. "Something he overlooked, and I still have a key." An hour later, after a nerve-wracking drive across town, they stood outside Greg Hamilton's luxury condo at the Pinnacle Residences. The key, a relic from a life Abby now realized might never have been real, felt cold and alien in her hand. "Are you sure about this, Abby?" Susan whispered, glancing nervously down the empty, opulent hallway. "This feels like crossing a line." "He crossed the line when he humiliated me at our wedding," Abby replied grimly, her voice tight with a cold anger she hadn't known she possessed. "He crossed the line when he lied to me for 3 years. I just want the truth. Susan, I need to know the extent of it." With trembling fingers, she inserted the key into the lock. It turned with a soft click. Inside, Greg's apartment was exactly as Abby remembered, impeccably decorated, minimalist to the point of sterility, a monument to expensive, impersonal taste. They moved carefully, almost stealthily, through the silent rooms, uncertain what they were looking for, their hearts pounding in unison. It was in Greg's home office, a room usually kept pristine, that they found it. The desk, normally clear, was now littered with documents, and a laptop was left open. Asleep. Sophia, no, Abby, she had to be Abby now, approached cautiously, feeling like an intruder despite her burning sense of justification. "Abby, look at this," Susan breathed, her voice hushed as she picked up a sleek, dark gray folder from a stack on the corner of the desk. The label on the folder, typed in a clean, corporate font, read Montague Legacy Project. Her blood ran cold. Inside were photographs of her, Abby, going back years, candid shots of her having coffee with friends, teaching at Sunny Meadows, walking in the park, even one of her and Greg on an early date, and, chillingly, a slightly blurry photo of her meeting Greg for the very first time at that community center. Each photo was dated, some annotated with handwritten notes about her routine, her connections, her personal habits. "Oh my God," Abby whispered, her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the folder. This was an operation. He was tracking me." Below the photographs, they found a sheaf of emails, printed out, communication between Greg Hamilton and Vince Ramsey, spanning 3 years. They discussed the target clearly, Abby, the approach strategy, integration phase, presumably their relationship and marriage, and, more recently, contingency plans following Walter Montague's sudden appearance at the wedding. As they read through the cold, clinical exchanges, a horrifying picture emerged. Greg Hamilton had been identified, perhaps even hired, by Vince Ramsey years ago, tasked with locating Walter Montague's lost daughter, gaining her trust, and eventually marrying her. The goal, it seemed, was to keep her unaware of her true heritage if possible, or, if she did find out, to ensure Greg controlled her, reporting her activities and any potential claims back to Vince. This was to prevent her from ever truly reconnecting with Walter, and asserting any claim to the Montague global tech empire, thereby securing Vince's position as heir apparent. But the most disturbing document of all, tucked at the very back of the folder, was a draft of what appeared to be a post-nuptial agreement. It was clearly designed to be presented to Abby after their marriage. It contained complex provisions giving Greg Hamilton significant control over any inheritance she might receive from Walter Montague, with a particularly chilling clause regarding management of assets in case of spouse's incapacitation or death. He was going to marry me, Abby thought, her mind reeling, take control of anything I inherited from Walter. And then, she couldn't finish the thought. "We need to go," Susan said urgently, her face pale as she quickly took photos of the most incriminating documents with her phone. "Before he comes back." As they gathered the folder and prepared to flee, Abby's eye caught an appointment in Greg's open laptop calendar for that very evening, VR strategy discussion, 9 hours p.m. VK, Vince Kingsley. The current time on her phone read 8:45 p.m. They barely made it out of the building, hearts hammering, before Greg Hamilton's expensive sports car purred into the private underground garage. From the shadowed anonymity of a bus stop across the street, they watched in horrified silence as, mere minutes later, Vince Ramsey's black sedan arrived. Vince emerged, entering the Pinnacle residences with the confident, familiar stride of someone who had clearly been there many times before. "We have to tell Walter," Susan said, her voice trembling as they hurried away into the night. "Now, to realize that a love you believed in, a future you planned, was nothing more than a meticulously crafted illusion, a cold, corporate strategy. The pain must be unimaginable. How does one even begin to fight back against such a deeply entrenched, profoundly personal betrayal, especially when the conspirators are meeting at that very moment to plot their next move? In the opulent calm of Walter Montague's New York penthouse, though for narrative consistency within Harmony Hills, let's place this as his equally luxurious penthouse suite at the Oakwood Grand Hotel. Overlooking the twinkling lights of the city, the ugly truth of the conspiracy lay bare, casting a long, dark shadow over the morning sun. Abby Evans, flanked by a fiercely protective Susan Miller, had laid out the contents of the Montague Legacy Project folder on Walter's antique mahogany desk, the surveillance photos, the damning emails between Greg Hamilton and Vince Ramsey, the chilling draft of the post-nuptial agreement. Eleanor Vance, Walter's ever-composed chief of staff, stood nearby, her usual serene expression replaced by a tight mask of cold fury as she examined the evidence. Walter Montague himself sat in his leather armchair, his movements controlled, his face a study in granite, but his eyes, those intense blue eyes so like Abby's, blazed with a cold, dangerous fury that Abby had never seen before. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the rustle of paper as Walter methodically reviewed each document. "They've been plotting against both of you for years," Abby said, her voice still shaking slightly as she clutched the folder of evidence they had taken from Greg's apartment. Her mind was reeling, not just from Greg's initial rejection at the altar, but from the sheer, calculated deception that had preceded it. Every shared laugh, every tender moment, every whispered promise of a future together, it had all been a lie, part of a cold-blooded strategy to control her, to isolate her, to protect Vince Ramsey's coveted position as Walter's heir. Yet, even as anger and a profound sense of violation threatened to overwhelm her, Abby felt a strange, new clarity emerging, a steely resolve solidifying within her. She wasn't just Walter Montague's long-lost, vulnerable daughter anymore. She was a woman who had been underestimated, manipulated, and profoundly wronged. And now, with the truth in her hands, she would show Greg Hamilton and Vince Ramsey exactly how much they had misjudged her. "Are you absolutely certain about this, Abigail?" Walter finally asked, his voice quiet but resonant with suppressed anger, as he finished reviewing the last of the damning emails. "The implications, they are severe." "I wish I wasn't, Dad," Abby replied, the word dad now feeling more natural, a small anchor in the storm. "But it's all there, in black and white. Greg has been working with Vince from the very beginning, our entire relationship. From that first chance meeting at the community center, was orchestrated to keep me from finding you, or, if I did, to control me. Walter placed the documents carefully on his desk, his movements precise, deliberate. "And the wedding," he said, his voice dangerously low. "The public rejection. I think that was unplanned, actually," Abby said, thinking back to the panicked tone in some of the later emails between Greg and Vince. "Based on the messages we found, Vince wanted Greg to go through with the marriage. The plan was for Greg to then use that post-nuptial agreement to control any inheritance I might receive from you. But something clearly went wrong at the ceremony." "Beatrice Hamilton," Susan interjected quietly. "Greg's mother. She never approved of Abby, not from day one. And from what we saw, from her expression at the chapel, she was pressuring him right up until the moment he was supposed to say his vows. He cracked under her influence. Which ironically created the very situation they were trying to prevent, my appearance at the church," Walter mused, a grim understanding dawning in his eyes. If Greg had simply married Abigail as planned, if he hadn't publicly humiliated her, I might never have revealed myself that day. They sabotaged their own scheme. He nodded slowly, a mirthless smile touching his lips. "And now they're scrambling to recover? Vince, by threatening me, trying to force me to sign away my rights," Abby added. "And Greg, by suddenly wanting to elope, to get me away from you, to isolate me again." Walter's expression darkened further. "Did you find any evidence, any hint of what they planned after securing control of your inheritance through that document?" Abby hesitated, the memory of that chilling clause in the post-nup, management of assets in case of spouse's incapacitation or death, sending a fresh wave of cold dread through her. "There was a clause," she said slowly, "about management of assets in case of my incapacitation or death. And Susan found out Greg's real estate company, Hamilton Developments, is nearly bankrupt. He needs money, desperately." The implications were disturbing, chillingly so. "What do we do now?" Abby asked, looking from Walter to Eleanor. "Go to the police." Walter exchanged a look with Eleanor Vance. "The evidence is compelling. Abigail, certainly," Eleanor said, her voice crisp and professional. "But much of it, particularly the financial ties between Crestline, Apex Ventures, and Vince, could potentially be explained away in court as complex but legitimate business connections rather than outright conspiracy. Vince is very careful, very meticulous. He would have insulated himself legally as much as possible. So, they just get away with it?" Susan asked, her voice filled with incredulous outrage. "No," Walter said, his voice suddenly hard with a steely determination that made Abby sit up straighter. "They most certainly do not get away with it." He turned to Abby, a new, strategic light in his eyes. "But we need to be smart about this. Abigail, we need to be strategic. You mentioned Greg has proposed again, that he wants to elope." Abby nodded. "He's been pushing for a quick ceremony, a destination wedding, just the two of us. He says it's to avoid family pressure, to start fresh." "And what if you were to counter-propose something else?" Walter suggested, a plan clearly forming in his mind. "A second wedding, yes, but not an elopement. Something here, in Harmony Hills, something elegant, but intimate. Just close family, a few key friends, and a few carefully selected MGT business associates." Abby caught his meaning immediately. "Including Vince Ramsey?" she breathed. "And Greg, of course," Walter confirmed, a predatory glint in his eyes. "A perfect opportunity, wouldn't you say, to gather all the players in one place." "You want me to pretend I'm taking Greg back?" Abby asked, a wave of distaste washing over her at the thought. The idea of feigning affection for the man who had so cruelly betrayed her, who had been part of such a vile, calculated deception, was repulsive. "Just long enough." "Abigail," Walter explained, his voice softening as he saw her revulsion. "Long enough to expose him and Vince, not necessarily in a court of law, which could drag on for years with an uncertain outcome, but in front of witnesses who matter, the MGT board members, key investors, our chief legal counsel, people whose opinion, whose condemnation, could actually damage them, ruin their reputations, far more effectively than a criminal case might." Abby considered the proposal. The idea of pretending to reconcile with Greg was still deeply distasteful, but the prospect of publicly exposing his betrayal, of taking control of the narrative that had been so cruelly twisted against her, of seeing justice done not in the sterile confines of a courtroom, but in the court of public and professional opinion, that held an undeniable, powerful appeal. It would need to be convincing, Eleanor Vance cautioned, her practical mind already assessing the risks. Greg, and especially Vince, would be highly suspicious of a sudden reconciliation. They're not fools. Abby looked at her father, at Eleanor, at Susan. She thought of the years of searching, the years of lies, the chilling implications of that post-nuptial agreement. A new resolve, cold and hard, settled within her. "I can be convincing," she said, her voice steady, her chin lifting. "They've underestimated me from the beginning. They think I'm just a kindergarten teacher from Willow Creek, in over her head, easily manipulated." A small, almost dangerous smile touched her lips. It's time to show them exactly how wrong they are. Over the following 2 weeks, Abby executed her part of the plan with a precision and emotional control that surprised even herself. She responded to Greg's increasingly desperate messages with carefully calibrated reluctance, followed by a slow, tentative emergence of forgiveness. She allowed him to believe that his charm, his persistence, his declarations of undying love were wearing down her defenses. "I'm still hurt by what happened at the chapel, Greg," she told him during a carefully staged chance encounter at the Corner Nook, her favorite coffee shop, a meeting orchestrated by Susan to appear entirely accidental. "Deeply hurt, but—" she paused, letting him lean in, hang on her words. "Maybe you're right about second chances. Maybe we rushed into things." Greg seized the opening eagerly, his relief palpable. "Oh, Abby, yes, let me prove myself to you," he pleaded, his eyes shining with what he clearly hoped looked like sincerity. "We can elope, just as I said, start fresh, away from all the pressure and complications." Abby feigned thoughtful consideration. "Actually, Greg," she replied, her voice carefully modulated to sound hesitant but hopeful, "I've been thinking about that. Eloping. It feels like hiding, doesn't it? Like we're ashamed, or like we have something to run from. If we're really going to start over, I want to do it properly, with the people who matter to us present, to show them that we're strong, that we've overcome this." "You mean another wedding?" Greg asked, a flicker of alarm, quickly suppressed, in his eyes. "Something small and elegant," Abby assured him, her gaze artlessly innocent. "Just close family, a few key friends, including my father, of course. He'd want to be there, to give me away properly this time." Greg's expression shifted subtly at the mention of Walter Montague. A flicker of calculation, of renewed opportunity, danced behind his earnest facade. His desire for a private elopement, for whisking Abby away from her father's influence, seemed to evaporate instantly once Walter's attendance, and by implication, his tacit approval and potential financial blessing, was promised. "Of course, Abby," he said, his voice now smooth with feigned enthusiasm. "If that's what would make you happy, then that's what we'll do." It takes a certain kind of courage, doesn't it, to walk back into the fire, to play a part in such a high-stakes drama, especially when your own heart has been so grievously wounded. One wonders if justice, when it comes, will be worth the emotional cost of such a dangerous charade. The morning of the second wedding dawned bright and clear over Harmony Hills, a perfect spring day for an event that was anything but a celebration of love. It was a meticulously planned stage for a reckoning. As Abby Evans prepared in a luxurious suite at the Hotel Astoria, a world away from her modest Willow Creek apartment, she felt a strange, almost preternatural calm. Zoe, no, Susan Miller, her steadfast friend, was there, helping her into a gown that was the antithesis of her first ill-fated wedding dress. Where that had been simple, carefully budgeted, and chosen with naive hope, this was a designer creation, an elegant, sophisticated masterpiece of silk and understated Parisian lace, personally chosen by Walter Montague. It subtly conveyed the Montague, wealth and taste, a silent statement in itself. "How are you feeling?" Susan asked, her eyes searching Abby's as she fastened the last tiny pearl button at the back of the gown. "Strangely calm," Abby replied, studying her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. She looked different, not just because of the exquisite dress, but because of something in her eyes, a new resilience, a quiet determination. "It's like everything that happened," she mused. Greg's rejection at the Grand Chapel, finding Dad, discovering their whole disgusting plot. It was all leading to this moment. Poetic justice. Susan nodded, her own eyes glinting with anticipation. "Exposing them at a wedding, just like Greg humiliated you at a wedding. Couldn't have written it better myself." A soft knock at the door, and Walter Montague entered, impeccably dressed in a bespoke morning suit, his silver hair gleaming. He stopped at the sight of Abby, and for a moment, the powerful CEO, the tech billionaire, vanished, replaced by a father overwhelmed with emotion. "Abigail," he said, his voice thick, "you look beautiful." "Thank you, Dad," Abby replied, a genuine warmth spreading through her, a sudden shyness surprising her. "Thank you for everything, for the dress, for this chance to set things right." "You've done the hard part, sweetheart," Walter assured her, his eyes filled with pride and a touch of concern. Keeping up this pretense with Greg, with Hamilton, couldn't have been easy. Abby smoothed her hands over the cool silk of her gown. "Actually," she confessed, "it was easier than I expected. Once I saw the truth about him, about what he and Vince Ramsey were capable of, it was like looking at a stranger wearing a familiar face. The man I thought I loved, the Greg I thought I knew. He never really existed." Walter offered his arm. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice gentle. Abby took a deep breath and nodded. "Absolutely." The rooftop garden of the Hotel Astoria had been transformed into an elegant, intimate wedding venue. White flowers and lush greenery created an atmosphere of simple sophistication, a stark contrast to the cold grandeur of the Grand Chapel. Unlike Abby's first wedding, this gathering was deliberately small, perhaps 50 guests in total, each carefully selected by Walter and Eleanor Vance for their significance in either exposing or witnessing the coming revelation. Key MGT board members, influential investors, the company's chief legal counsel, even a discreetly placed business journalist from a national paper known for its incisive financial exposés. Greg Hamilton waited at the makeshift altar, handsome and confident in his tuxedo, his charming smile betraying no hint of his true intentions or his impending doom. In the front row sat his mother, Beatrice Hamilton, looking considerably more approving this time, no doubt envisioning the Montague alliance. Beside her, looking smooth and self-assured, was Vince Ramsey, his expression neutral, but his eyes, as always, watchful, calculating. The small string quartet began to play a soft, classical piece, and the guests rose as Walter escorted Abby down the aisle. She could feel the weight of Vince Ramsey's gaze as she approached, the silent, arrogant assessment behind his polite smile. Greg extended his hand as they reached the altar, and Abby allowed Walter to place her hand in his. One final act of deception before the truth was revealed. The minister, a distinguished older gentleman, hand-picked by Eleanor for his discretion and gravitas, began the ceremony, his words flowing smoothly, a calm prelude to the storm. He reached the familiar phrase, the one that had signaled disaster once before. "If anyone can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace." In the expectant pause that followed, a pause that crackled with unspoken tension, Abby gently, decisively, withdrew her hand from Greg's deceptively warm grip. "Actually," she said, her voice clear, resonant, carrying easily across the rooftop garden, "before we proceed, I'd like to share something with everyone." Greg blinked in confusion, his smile faltering. "Abby, darling, what?" "Security," Walter said quietly, almost a whisper, and immediately several of his well-dressed security team, who had been posing as guests, moved discreetly but purposefully into position. Two flanked Vince Ramsey, one moved near Greg Hamilton, and others subtly blocked the exits. Abby turned to face the guests, her gaze sweeping over their surprised faces. "I want to thank you all for coming today," she began, her voice steady, imbued with a newfound authority. Especially those of you who witnessed my humiliation at my first wedding, when Greg Hamilton declared me too poor to marry. Murmurs rippled through the small, influential crowd. I'm sure you're wondering why I would give him a second chance. Greg reached for her arm, his composure cracking. Darling, this isn't the time. Actually, Greg, Abby replied, stepping away from him, her voice gaining strength. It's exactly the time. You see, I've recently discovered that my entire relationship with Greg, our 3 years together, our engagement, was a fraud. Another wave of shocked whispers. A calculated plan, Abby continued, her eyes locking onto Vince Ramsey, then Greg, orchestrated by him and by Mr. Vince Ramsey there, to prevent me from discovering my true identity as Walter Montague's daughter, and failing that, to control me and any inheritance I might receive. Vince Ramsey rose to his feet, his face a mask of outraged indignation. This is absurd, he boomed. Walter, control your daughter's theatrics. This is preposterous. I think we should hear what she has to say. Vince, Walter replied calmly, his voice like steel beneath velvet. At his almost imperceptible signal, Eleanor Vance, cool and efficient, activated a large projection screen that had been cleverly disguised among the floral wedding decorations. On it appeared the first of many incriminating documents, an email chain between Greg Hamilton and Vince Ramsey, dated 3 years prior, discussing the target, A.M. Abigail Montague, though then Parker and their long-term acquisition and control strategy. Sophia, Abby continued, her voice ringing with conviction. For 3 years, Greg Hamilton has been reporting on my activities to Vince Ramsey, ensuring I remained unaware of my heritage. Their goal was to keep me separated from my father, and when that failed, when my father found me, their plan shifted to secure control of any inheritance I might receive, through marriage and manipulation. Greg's face had drained of all color. Abby, Sophia, these are obviously fabricated, he stammered, his eyes darting desperately between her and the damning evidence on the screen. Someone is trying to drive us apart. Like this document, Greg? Abby asked icily, as Eleanor displayed the scanned image of the draft post-nuptial agreement, the one giving him control over her assets in case of her incapacitation or death. Was that fabricated too, Greg? When you planned to have me sign it after our loving wedding, Beatrice Hamilton, in the front row, rose shakily to her feet, her face a ghastly shade of pale. Greg, she whispered, aghast. What is she talking about? What have you done? But Greg was already moving, attempting to push past one of the security personnel towards the exit. This is a private matter between Abby and me, if you'll excuse me. I'm afraid we can't let you leave just yet, Mr. Hamilton, Walter said, his voice still calm but now carrying an undeniable chill. He nodded to his security team, who, firmly, impassively, blocked Greg's path. Not when there's so much more to discuss. Like, for instance, the embezzlement Mr. Ramsey has apparently been conducting from Montague Global Tech for the past 5 years. This new accusation sent a fresh shockwave through the assembled guests. Vince Ramsey's face contorted with rage. You have no proof of that. Walter, this is slander. Actually, Vince, we do, Eleanor Vance replied coolly, advancing the slideshow to display a series of complex financial records, offshore account statements linked to shell companies under Vince's indirect control. Once we began investigating your connection to Mr. Hamilton, we discovered certain irregularities. Our forensic accounting team has prepared a comprehensive report for the MGT board. Several of the board members present exchanged alarmed, grim glances. The company's chief legal counsel was already leaning forward, his eyes narrowed in intense concentration as he reviewed the documents on the screen. Vince Ramsey's carefully constructed composure finally shattered. This is a setup, Walter, he yelled, his voice hoarse. You've orchestrated this whole charade because you can't accept that your long-lost, unqualified daughter isn't fit to run your company. I've given you 15 years of my life, and I've compensated you generously for your service. Vince, Walter replied evenly, his gaze unwavering. But conspiring to manipulate my daughter, planning to control her inheritance through coercion, deceit, and potentially even endangering her life by leveraging my health concerns. These aren't actions I can forgive or forget. Greg, seeing his position, his entire future, growing increasingly untenable, changed tactics, turning to Abby with a look of desperate, pleading sincerity. "Abby, please," he implored, his voice cracking. "Whatever you think you found, it's been misinterpreted. I love you, Abby. I've always loved you. Victor, Vince. He may have approached me years ago. Yes, he might have suggested things. But my feelings for you, those are real. They've always been real. Were they real when you called me too poor at the altar, Greg?" Abby asked quietly, her voice cutting through his desperate performance. "Or did they only become real when you discovered who my father was?" "You don't understand the pressure I was under," Greg insisted, his eyes wild. "My company, Hamilton Developments, it was struggling. My mother, Beatrice, she had expectations. You're right about one thing, Greg," Abby interrupted, her voice now clear and strong, resonating with a newfound power. "I don't understand. I don't understand betraying someone I claim to love. I don't understand plotting to control their inheritance, their life. And I certainly," she added, her gaze sweeping over both him and a now ashen-faced Vince Ramsey, "don't understand the kind of person who would value wealth, power, and ambition over simple human decency, over integrity." The guests were now openly murmuring, many recording the extraordinary confrontation on their phones. Among them were the several influential business journalists Walter had specifically invited, ensuring this story, this takedown, would spread quickly and comprehensively through the right channels. Vince Ramsey, seeing his carefully constructed future, his 15 years of meticulous planning, crumbling into ruin before his very eyes, made one last, desperate attempt. "The MGT board won't stand for this. Walter," he shouted, his voice ragged, "I've been groomed as your successor for a decade. Montague Global Tech needs experienced leadership, not a kindergarten teacher playing at business." It was the MGT chief legal counsel who interjected then, his voice calm and authoritative. "Actually, Mr. Ramsey," he stated, "the board serves at the pleasure of the majority shareholder, which is Mr. Montague. And as for succession, he is well within his rights to designate his daughter as his heir, regardless of her current business experience. She could, for instance, appoint a team of experienced executives to run daily operations while maintaining ownership control and strategic oversight." As security personnel began to firmly escort a sputtering Vince Ramsey and a now utterly defeated Greg Hamilton from the rooftop garden, Greg turned back to Abby, his handsome face contorted into a sneer of pure malice. "You really were too poor, Abby," he snarled, his voice dripping with venom. "Too poor in spirit, too naive to see what we could have built together, what you could have had. You're just like your father," he spat, his eyes flicking towards Walter, "choosing your pathetic pride over real power, real wealth." Abby watched them go, feeling not triumph, not elation, but a quiet, profound resolve. "You're wrong, Greg," she called after him, her voice clear and steady, reaching him just before he disappeared from view. "I chose integrity over deception. I chose love over manipulation. And that's a kind of wealth, a kind of power you'll never understand." After they were gone, a heavy silence fell over the rooftop garden, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves in the spring breeze. Walter Montague addressed the remaining guests, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "I sincerely apologize for the unorthodox nature of this gathering. While it clearly wasn't the wedding celebration you, or indeed we, expected to witness, I hope you understand the necessity of addressing these grievous matters openly and decisively." He paused, then a rare, small smile touched his lips. "Please, join us for the reception that's been prepared. This may not be a wedding celebration in the traditional sense, but it is most certainly a day worth commemorating, a day of truth, of justice, and for me, personally, a day of profound gratitude for the return of my daughter. As the guests began to move towards the reception area, many stopping to express their support, their sympathy, their admiration to Abby, she found herself standing alone for a moment by the flower-laden altar that had been meant for her second sham marriage. The irony wasn't lost on her. Twice she had approached this threshold, this symbol of union and commitment, and twice the ceremony had been spectacularly derailed. But this time, she thought, a quiet strength filling her. This time, she had been in control. Alexander, Walter, approached her then, concern etched in his eyes despite the successful outcome of their dangerous gambit. "Are you all right, Abigail?" he asked, his voice gentle. Abby smiled, surprised to find tears, not of sorrow, but of relief, of release, welling in her eyes despite her outward composure. "Yes, Dad," she said, her voice a little shaky. "Yes, I think I am. It's a lot to process. 6 weeks ago, I was a kindergarten teacher from Willow Creek, excited about marrying the man I loved. Now I've discovered my long-lost billionaire father. I've exposed a criminal conspiracy, and I've publicly humiliated 2 men who tried to manipulate and destroy me." She took a deep, steadying breath. "It's a lot of change to absorb in a very short time." Walter nodded thoughtfully, his gaze filled with a deep, understanding wisdom. "Life rarely follows the path we expect, Abigail," he said softly. "The question is, what do you want to do next?" Abby looked out over the glittering skyline of Harmony Hills, a city that suddenly felt both familiar and entirely new. "That's the strange part, Dad," she replied, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. "For the first time in weeks, for the first time in a very long time, I actually feel like I know." 6 months later, Abigail Evans Parker, she had decided to keep a part of the name her mother had given her, the name under which she had built her own life, while also embracing the heritage of her father, stood at a podium in the grand ballroom of the newly established Montague Family Foundation headquarters in Harmony Hills. She was addressing a gathered crowd of community leaders, educators, philanthropists, and MGT executives at the official launch of the Foundation's flagship education initiative, a project she had passionately spearheaded. The Foundation, her foundation, would provide scholarships, resources, and support to underserved communities throughout the region, with a special focus on early childhood education, her lifelong passion. "Some people measure wealth by bank accounts and possessions," she told the captivated audience, her voice clear and confident. "But I've learned that true wealth, the kind that endures, the kind that truly matters, lies in our connections, in our compassion, and in our ability to make a genuine difference in the lives of others." In the front row, Walter Montague sat watching his daughter, his eyes shining with unmistakable pride. His health, under a new, cutting-edge treatment protocol developed by leading researchers, funded, of course, by a significant grant from the Montague fortune, had stabilized. While his condition remained serious, Dr. Finch and his team were now cautiously optimistic about his extended prognosis. He had more time, precious time. After the presentation, as guests mingled and celebrated the Foundation's launch, Abby spotted a familiar face among the catering staff. It was Greg Hamilton, noticeably less polished than she remembered, his expensive suits replaced by a starched white server's jacket, offering champagne with a forced, brittle smile. Their eyes met briefly across the crowded room. He looked away quickly, a flush rising on his neck. The public disgrace of his exposed schemes, coupled with the subsequent collapse of Hamilton Developments, had permanently damaged his once promising career. Vince Ramsey had faced more serious consequences. The evidence of embezzlement from MGT, meticulously compiled by Walter's forensic accounting team, had been irrefutable, leading to swift criminal charges and a barrage of civil lawsuits. Last Abby had heard, he was awaiting trial, his carefully constructed reputation in tatters, his future looking bleak. "Quite a turnaround, isn't it?" Susan Miller commented, appearing at Abby's side with 2 glasses of champagne, nodding discreetly towards Greg. "From calling you too poor to marry, to serving drinks at your foundation launch, life has a funny way of balancing the scales sometimes." Abby took a sip of champagne, her expression thoughtful. "It does," she agreed. "Though I take no pleasure in his downfall, Susan, just a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he can't hurt anyone else the way he tried to hurt me." Later that evening, Abby drove to her mother and Frank's modest suburban home in a quiet Harmony Hills neighborhood. They were hosting a small family dinner to celebrate the foundation's successful launch. Walter had been invited as well, a development that would have seemed utterly impossible just a few short months earlier. As Abby entered the familiar, comfortable living room, the one where she'd grown up, she found Helen and Walter sitting together on the worn floral sofa, looking at old photo albums. Helen was sharing childhood memories, stories of a gap-toothed, pigtailed Abby that Walter had missed, both of them laughing easily over her elementary school pictures. "There she is," Helen called out when she noticed Abby, her face beaming with a relaxed, genuine happiness Abby hadn't seen in years. "The woman of the hour." "Hardly, Mom." Abby laughed, accepting her mother's warm hug. "I just gave a speech. The real work, building the foundation, is just beginning." "Don't diminish what you've accomplished, Abigail," Walter admonished gently, his eyes twinkling. "Creating a foundation that merges your passion for education with the resources to make a significant, lasting impact, that's no small achievement. It's a legacy of a different kind." As they gathered around the dinner table, Abby, Walter, Helen, Frank, and Susan, a scene that would have been unimaginable just months ago, Abby felt a profound sense of gratitude wash over her. Despite the betrayal and pain she had endured, she wouldn't change the path that had led her here, to this moment of authentic connection with both her parents, to this newfound sense of purpose. Frank proposed a toast, his voice filled with a quiet warmth. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass, "to long overdue reunions, and to the family we choose and build, despite life's obstacles." "To family," they all echoed, their glasses clinking in the warm light of the dining room. Later, as Abby helped her mother with the dishes in the small, familiar kitchen, while Walter and Frank discussed baseball, of all things, in the living room, Helen nudged her daughter gently. "Are you happy, sweetheart?" she asked, her eyes searching Abby's. "Really happy so much has changed in your life? So quickly?" Abby paused, considering the question seriously, drying a plate with thoughtful care. "I am, Mom," she replied truthfully, a soft, genuine smile gracing her lips. "I really am. Not in the way I expected to be 6 months ago, not with the white picket fence and the society wedding, but in a deeper way, a truer way." She looked out the kitchen window at the quiet suburban street, then back at her mother. "I think I know who I am now, not just as Walter Montague's daughter, or even as Greg Hamilton's ex-fiancée, but as myself, Abigail Evans Parker, a kindergarten teacher from Willow Creek who also happens to run a rather wonderful foundation." She grinned. "A woman who knows her own worth, a worth that can't be measured by anyone else's standards, or by the size of a bank account." Helen squeezed her daughter's hand, her own eyes shining with unshed tears of pride and relief. "That's the greatest wealth of all, my darling," she said softly, "and it's something no one can ever take from you." Through the doorway, Abby could see Walter laughing at something Frank had said. Two men from entirely different worlds finding common ground, a shared affection in their care for the same family. She thought about the incredible, tumultuous journey that had brought them all to this point, the humiliation at the Grand Chapel that had, paradoxically, revealed her true heritage, the devastating betrayal by Greg and Vince that had ultimately freed her from a life built on lies, the terrifying, empowering confrontation on the Skyline Terrace that had allowed her to reclaim her narrative, her voice, her power. "You're too poor," Greg Hamilton had sneered at that first wedding. How wrong he had been. Abigail Evans Parker had never been poor in the ways that truly mattered, in courage, in integrity, in resilience, in the capacity to forge genuine, loving connections. And now, surrounded by her reconstructed family, not perfect, still healing, but authentic and strong in every way that counted, she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that she was wealthy beyond measure. Abby's journey from heartbreak to empowerment reminds us that true wealth isn't about money, but about integrity, love, and the courage to reclaim one's story. If her resilience resonated with you, perhaps you'll share your own thoughts on what true wealth means to you in the comments below. We'd love to hear them. And if you'd like to join us for more stories that explore the depths of human experience, do consider subscribing. Until next time, remember the strength that lies within you and the authentic connections that make life truly rich.